that spending. They get to design how it should get done, then they get to ask for all kinds of data, then they get to say, no, you qualify, don't qualify. So I would say India started in the wrong place in terms of federalism and has regressed aggressively in the last 8 years or so.
We started in the wrong place and we have regressed. May I ask you, Ms. Reddy, for your view on that provocation, but also there was a third element to India's federal imagination, which was the local governments. In our constitution in 1950, we placed that into the directive principles, and it took all the way till the early 1990s and a constitutional amendment for them to be formally recognized as part of India's federal architecture. Did we, constitutionally, was that a mistake? Did we wait too long to recognize local governments and place them firmly within the architecture of our federal structure?
Yeah, first of all, thanks to the organizers and the founders of South First, Mr. Vasu and all the other founders, and also all the respected colleagues in the panel today. Well, coming to that, Yamini, I think you're very right in saying that it was delayed sizably, and then even after the delay, the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments that came in order to rectify that delay to some extent also did not actually materialize. Normally, there are two ways. One, the requirement of various areas or territories to come together and be one in order to have a common cause or protection or a common future, etc. The other is to hold territories by way of having a country or a republic. India actually became a union in peculiar circumstances, which with a long history and various happenings. So the aspirations of the people of this country at that point of time when we got independence would be quite different from what the generation of today actually see or perceive. The local bodies should have been strengthened and should have been firmly in place right from day one. Because of the delay and because of it not happening, gradually over a period of time, there arose some sort of a blurredness between the relationship between center and state. Now states are complaining about the federal structure that includes autonomy, that includes fiscal matters. But how much are the states actually looking into the local bodies? How many states actually have empowered Zilla Parishads? How many states actually have empowered the Mandal Parishads or the Taluks? How many states have actually empowered the Panchayats? So sometimes what we do, we get in return. So I feel that this structure, federal structure, if implemented in spirit and objective right to the level of Gram Panchayat, will actually over a period of time stop this change of policy or change of objective which actually was envisaged by the authors of our constitution.
Thank you. I hope we can discuss. We have 3 different states here and Kerala. So 4. So I hope we can also look at the differences in local government participation across the different states too, which is such a unique characteristic of our federal structure as well. But let me pick up on this question of, so maybe in 1950 it was somewhat regressive, or at least at any rate there was an imagination of a relatively strong center. But if you look at the arc of independent India, especially after single party dominance of Congress starts breaking, democracy gives you a great vibrancy of federalism. So to Ambedkar's imagination of us moving from unitary to federalism, regional parties start playing a really important role in our national politics as well. Yet, the puzzle that has always been on my mind, why is it in those peak years of very vibrant, in fact, at some point, political scientists would argue that national elections in India are in fact state elections, because it's this coming together of states that is forming the coalitions on the, in Delhi. Yet very little was done to shift this initial architecture. Shashi, what is your view on that?
Well, I think that a lot depends on how the government of the center runs the country. And I think with the exception of a brief period in the 90s, when there was even talk of the states owning Delhi, when the government was essentially comprised largely of regional parties, you do have parties with a so-called national vision in power in Delhi who tend to ride roughshod over the rights and sensibilities of states. I mean, a very good example was as recently as the proclamation of the lockdown for COVID, where though the states would have to implement that lockdown, they were not consulted. It was a decision announced by the Prime Minister on television sort of 3 hours before it needed to be implemented. And it was done using a rather obscure article of the National Disaster Management Act. But that was the end of any pretense of federal authority on this. It was just as when Mrs. Gandhi proclaimed the emergency in 75, the states sort of woke up to the news. The same thing happened with the COVID lockdown. And you see this time and time again, even since PTR was talking about fiscal allocations. Look at the allocations for to the states from the Disaster Management Fund. When COVID came along, you'll see no relationship between the population of the states, their COVID burden, the number of migrants they had to deal with, and the amount of money that that fund decided to allocate to them. So we're seeing time after time the tendency of those in power in Delhi, using, of course, the argument of the national vision to take those decisions. I do take the point that you and Mr. Reddy have made about the local governments. I think Kerala is an honorable exception in many ways, in that local governments have been empowered to a very great extent, and that you're seeing some genuine devolution of authority, though not yet budgetary, not yet adequate budgetary means. But it's still better than most other states that I'm aware of. And that is an anomaly in all this, because if the states can argue that they are being wrongly treated by the center, the districts can argue they're being wrongly treated by the states. Having said that, the states have a good excuse nowadays, which is that the money they're getting from the center hasn't gone up. It's very interesting when you saw the 14th Finance Commission recommending a significant increase in the proportion of taxes that should be paid to the states. Promptly, the central government implemented that and then reduced instead the amount of other tax they could hold on to. So the net result was a wash. I mean, the states didn't get a penny more, though the argument was they needed more money that they could have the discretion to spend. So there's no question that, I mean, as PTR has argued, that you are seeing a heavy tilting of the scales towards the union government, and that's become more pronounced, it seems to me, in recent years.
So you mentioned the 14th Finance Commission, and it was, I think, in more ways than one, a watershed moment for fiscal federalism in India by virtue of the attempt to enhance devolution to states. But about that time, colleagues and I were spending a fair amount of time talking to line ministries and bureaucrats within states. And one of the things that struck us a lot in those conversations is how much, at least the bureaucracy in the line departments, were unhappy, because what the center did was, having done the devolution, it reduced the allocations to several centrally sponsored schemes. Now, centrally sponsored schemes have been the bane of most state governments since the 1960s. I think commission after commission after commission has complained about centrally sponsored schemes, and attempts have been made every now and again to reduce the number of centrally sponsored schemes from 500 to 120, then it goes back to 200. Now apparently it's 28, but it's actually about 150. And if you look at the DBT database, there's 400 schemes that the government of India has for which money is flowing. So these abound everywhere, and state governments complain a lot. But I was struck, and this is an open question to any one of you who would want to pick this up to answer, why it is that, at least in the bureaucracy, at that particular moment, there was great annoyance about the reduction of centrally sponsored schemes. In fact, it felt like we had just turned the clock to say, don't take those back, give them back to us all over again, line department after line department, not finance departments, though, and I'll come to that in a minute. But what is it about the tensions of these centrally sponsored schemes? They've always been there. Politically, it's always been a source of complaining. But whenever they get reduced, the argument is for more.
I think Shashi lives in Delhi. He should take this. He has more interaction with
The
bureaucrats.
three
than
of
me.
you have full rights to answer that.
Let me just quickly jump in. You know, I think when Shashi was speaking, I was thinking of how India has really become. You know, as Tyaga said, I think over a period of time, it has really regressed, and the spirit of federalism really it has come to a situation where now everything is centered around people and personalities. You know, there was a time, with all due respect, when somebody famously said, India is Indira and Indira is India. You know, the whole personality cult thing. Now, something very similar, but even more, possibly more drastic, you know, where stadiums are being renamed, where medical colleges are being renamed, and I'm guessing if the Union Finance Minister has a way, I think the new currency notes also will have, you know, the Prime Minister's image. Possibly they'll even replace Mahatma Gandhi's image. I have no doubt in my mind. Because, you know, we have a situation where it's funny, embarrassing, and also sometimes upsetting. We've had the Union Finance Minister here recently, a couple of weeks ago. She went to a fair price shop in a district about 100 kilometers from here. And she was making a scene out there like a street-level BJP worker, asking the collector, right in front of about 200 people, as to where the Prime Minister's photo in the fair price shop was. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, if we are truly a federal republic, as we are supposed to be, why are we fighting over an individual's pictures and in the institutions that we've built at the grassroots level? I mean, if I can certainly counter it and say, you know, when Modi ji was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, did he put up Dr. Manmohan Singh's pictures in all the fair price shops in Gujarat? I don't think so. The point I'm trying to make is, none of our enactments, none of our legislations actually mandate this kind of cult worship. What has essentially happened, Yamini, in my humble opinion, is while we are called the world's largest parliamentary democracy, we function like a presidential democracy and not like a parliamentary democracy. Essentially, everything being centralized. And this applies to states as well, by the way. I'm not saying this only about the union government. I'm also saying the same thing about state government. Even the states, as Rajendra said, we do also, in fact, barring Kerala probably, I think we do not empower our local governments enough. We don't empower our local governments enough. So, yes, what you do is sometimes what you get. Karma is a boomerang, like they say. But the point is, we need to, at some point, draw lines, clear distinctions, and say, okay, now let's define our roles. The defense, railways, and there are certain areas we have simply no role. That should be left to the union government. And what is the union government doing today with respect to Narega? They want to deposit funds from the Narega kitty directly into the workers' account in a village. Now, do the states not get to decide what sort of work needs to be taken up? Kerala may have done some things. Telangana may have done some things. Tamil Nadu would want to do something else. And Andhra might be wanting to do something else. We are all on different stages of learning curve. Now, this is the essence of federalism, trying to ensure that we understand stronger the states are, stronger the country is going to be. Each state needs to align its priorities in tandem with its local governments. In Telangana, we run a program called as Palle Pragati and Pattan Pragati. Today, when Government of India is rated the top 20 best villages in the country, 19 are from Telangana because of this program. The point I'm trying to make is, when we are operating with a focus and when we are trying to up our game, all the union government needs to do is encourage performers and leave it to us to decide what central sponsored scheme that we need to participate in and what we can opt out of. If that sort of flexibility is given to us, as opposed to thrusting things down our throat, I think then we truly will become a strong nation, and as Prime Minister calls it, Amrut Kal and Achhe Din will come fairly quickly.
Flexibility in centrally sponsored schemes, PTR, do you think that's part of the menu of solutions to reimagining the federal compact?
Yeah, I'm not even clear why we should have centrally sponsored schemes as opposed to giving the money to the people, right? I have a video clip picking up from my friend of then Chief Minister of Gujarat, Thiru Narendra Modi, going on a long exposition. It's in Hindi. I can play it here if you want. Yeah, he says, you know, the states have been feeding the poor for decades. All of a sudden, the union comes and says, this is coming from me. What does that mean? All these things, right? So I think there are some clear roles for the union. Foreign affairs, defense, currency stabilization, trade, policies. But when it comes to what is right, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. You've seen so many CAG reports, not our reports, CAG reports that talk about Swachh Bharat scheme toilets built with no water, because the union government cannot supply water, only the local body can supply water. Or funds sent and not used because you cannot whitewash a thatched school. Right? And this notion that somehow you can direct or dictate policy. And then the question then is, what is the intent? Is it to create a kind of cult? Is it to, we have an insurance program, or for that matter, PDS. In all of these things, Tamil Nadu was certainly ahead of the Indian average or the design of the union scheme. Then they design a scheme, and then they say, you have to change the name. If you want some share of it to be funded by the union, you have to change the name. We have an insurance program. They want to partly fund some of it. They say you have to put the Prime Minister's image on the card, on the ID card. I mean, we were already doing it before. Now, you get some. So, and I'll go even to the extreme in terms of schemes, right? Like they have the scheme called Jal Jeevan scheme, right? And it started out with, 60 or 80-20, then 60-40, then 40-60, the usual model, sliding scale. But they incentivize you to actually take the tap into every house in every village. Now, in a lot of cases, the villagers don't want the tap in their house. They have their own, mores and their own psychology about it. They want a public tap on the street. In my constituency, in colonies where I've offered to run taps into the house, they say, no, leave the tap outside my house, not inside my house. But the scheme says you only get funding if you take the tap inside the house. Right? This last mile delivery, why should there be a standardized model coming from Delhi about last mile delivery? Different people have different preferences. That's what the states exist for. That's what the local bodies exist for. Now, as far as the local bodies, I definitely take my friend's comment because, he has, unlike me, he has served as a sarpanch at a local body level. I completely agree with the lack of devolution. But it's a double-edged sword. In the case of Tamil Nadu, a lot of our problems with local bodies have to do with the caste problem. And it has to do with no matter what you do about reservations and all that. Once you get to a granular level where within the same geographical area, you reserve this as let's say, a SC seat, but there is a whole lot of non-SC people there. You start having caste problems, and there's been violence and murders and all kinds of clashes and stuff like that. So my colleague, I'm also the Minister for Planning, my colleague, the Vice Chairman of the Planning Commission of Tamil Nadu, says the single biggest improvement in delivery of services and the equality of society in the rural areas of Tamil Nadu was when the line department started driving the programs rather than the local body elected officials. Because if they did that, it was very biased, and even letting out the temple lands and managing the tanks and all that, they would do on a caste basis or a communal basis or a religion basis or something. And once you standardize the model from Chennai, then it became actually better delivery. So I completely agree, you can't have it always. You can't say, I want devolution to my level, but not below me. And again, I think time changes things, right? If you have greater education levels, you have greater integration, more harmony, then you do more devolution. And I think some states, and maybe there's a correlation between the communist philosophy and the fact that Kerala has such high devolution, maybe. But
I think all parties take equal credit for that.
but some of these things should never be aggregated. There is no natural reason for a one-size-fits-all aggregated model coming from Delhi. That's my view.
I think one of the big governance challenges for India is that we still haven't passed out what level of government should be performing what level of function, and it leads to a consistent set of overlaps across the board. I was going to pose the next question, but you've thrown such an important provocation about local governments and the local context that I think, Mr. Reddy, you have to answer that. Because if I at the risk of making a too broad a statement out of your somewhat more nuanced point, would it be right to say that the inequalities at the grassroots level should necessitate a little bit more centralization from the state? I'm just throwing this out as a provocation because I think that's one of the very critical reasons why centralization at the state level has often happened at the cost of deeper devolution to local governments.
These things, Yamini, I feel are very state specific with in acknowledgement and also due respect to the opinions of my colleagues here. Transgression of responsibilities and duties, overlaps normally happen vertically. Now, the duty of a local body representative, a sarpanch or a taluk board president is well defined. But the MLA wants to go and see what all is happening, right from laying of drains to roads to water. This is clearly the role of a local body.
And the MP also with the MP lad
The
fund.
MP also. And now, MLA is transgressing into the local bodies, Parliament is transgressing into the legislatures, so is the result with regard to local bodies, legislatures and Parliament. Next comes whether there should be a more centralized monitoring and spending. I believe that in a democracy, ultimately, it is the elected representative who should have supreme power. He is elected by the public. If the public do not like his whatever capacities, there is always a provision to replace him when the period ends. But I have in my own experience seen that anybody who is elected by the public have a far better understanding of the needs of the public than anyone else in the system. And now when it comes to the expenditures that are made, now I belonging to a state as well as to a regional party, at the same time, to be fair and be objective, the money that is being spent by the center for the schemes, central sponsored schemes, are outside of the money that is already devolved to the states. So, when the center spends certain amount of money on CASDS, centralized state development schemes, or the centrally sponsored schemes. So, centrally sponsored schemes are 100% spent by the center, and CASDS are partly spent with contribution by the state. So, these are framed in such a way based on the requirement. Now, as Mr. PTR said, there are state-specific, and as Mr. KTR also said, state-specific needs are there where maybe the CASDS have to be, the states have to be given a little more autonomy to design schemes that are more suitable for their requirement. But at the same time, broadly speaking, when the center is spending money for the public, if the state wants to have its own emblem or own mark or trademark, so also we should allow the center to do it.
Okay, can I just interrupt for sorry to interrupt. My point is very simple, very straight. I agree with you and I don't have a problem with centrally sponsored schemes either. The problem arises when somebody tries to impose their ideology. The issue is not centrally sponsored schemes or the larger good that is aimed at for the betterment of the society. That is not a problem at all. See, between all of us, the southern states, we are 19% of the population of this country, but we contribute to 35% of the GDP of this country. So when somebody from Delhi flies into Hyderabad and tells us that I am the giver and you are the taker, you know the attitude that kicks in, you know that humne aapko 2 lakh crore diya. Now that really puts me off. Because you know, every rupee I contribute from Telangana, my exchequer contributes from Telangana, what we get back is 46 paisa. For every rupee that is contributed from the south of India, 35% of the GDP, we do not get back. I'm not even asking, I'm not even suggesting that I get back every single paisa. I know that there is defense, I know that there is railways, I know that there are laggard states, I know that there are roles that the government of India needs to fulfill, which of course we are happy to contribute and we are happy to, you know, as an Indian citizen, we are happy to, you know, be a part of the nation building. But the problem is the attitude of those who run Delhi. You know, they come with a chip on their shoulder and they tell us, listen, hum dene wale hain, aap lene wale hain. तो इसीलिए हम जब देते हैं, आप हम जो कहते हैं, whatever we say, you have to do. Now that is the problem, because Andhra has a certain challenge. Andhra has certain, you know, projects that they would like to complete. In Telangana, in the last 8 years, We have completed drinking water connection to each and every home. In fact, that became inspiration to Har Ghar Jal. In Telangana, we have done some very, very focused programs on tank revival. In Telangana, we've also completed some large lift irrigation projects. So I have a different set of priorities from my friends here. Now, why should I not get to decide what I should do with my devolution money and with also my money that is being proposed in centrally sponsored schemes? The last thing I'll say is, this whole myth about devolution, how it has been enhanced by Modi ji. Actually, the fact is, both the finance ministers can tell you, it is not 41% that we receive today. Because of all this cesses and other things that is happening, we only get 29%, which is far worse than what it was. So this whole, again, abrogation of sorts of responsibilities or, this obfuscation that they indulge in, and kind of try and take away the money that rightfully belongs to the states by way of imposing additional excise duties and other things. It is a travesty. So this needs to be challenged. This needs to be addressed. And if needed, it needs to be challenged legally as well.
In fact,
So as Mr. KTR said, the actual increase in devolution and more autonomy to the state happened during the 14th Finance Commission while Dr. Y.V. Reddy was the chairman. Because the 14th Finance Commission felt that states ought to have more autonomy and independence into doing what they want with the money, and it need not be dictated by the center. But unfortunately, that 42 finally now comes down to only about 30%, 10% lesser than what we are entitled to get for various reasons, cesses, etc., etc. But then coming to the issue of center-state, I think this relationship between center, state, federal structure, etc., has to happen from top to bottom. It cannot stop midway or start midway. It has to start from top and go down up to the Gram Panchayat level. Only then everybody understands what the actual responsibilities are, what the actual authorities are, and what the duties are.
Sorry, I just want to say one thing about the centrally sponsored schemes. I mean, I'm relatively new in politics, but 15th Finance Commission Chairman, Mr. N.K. Singh, at some seminar we were at, he said there wasn't actually this whole, it wasn't like a constitutional carve-out that there should be centrally sponsored schemes. Certain governments started it when states benefited and they still had a say in its design, and it was a participative kind of approach. They didn't object. This regime has just taken it to extremes and made it dictatorial and, to suit their political needs as opposed to the needs of the people. But it's not like inherent in the constitution that there should be centrally sponsored schemes. It's not like they're particularly well designed to execute anything. I mean, as I think former Chief Minister of then unified Andhra said, the union is a myth, right? It's an integration of all the money that comes from the states, politicians that come from the states, IAS officers that come from the states, IPS officers that come from the states. It is a temporary gathering of people to facilitate the distribution, redistribution, devolution of what comes from the states. It's not like it drops from the sky to the union and then they divide it up to us, right? So this notion that there should be something that they know better than us itself is a flawed notion, right? There's no natural place for them to have this. And I mean, listen, I'm far, far less strident than the former Chief Minister of Gujarat, Narendra Modi, when he said the same things when he was Chief Minister.
Well, when they abolished the Planning Commission, they should have got rid of the centrally sponsored schemes along with it, maybe.
No, but I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that came from that. In fact, when KTR was talking about how much money Telangana gets back on the taxes it pays, historically, the South has been subsidizing the North. There's very little doubt about that. And other states, I remember Mr. Siddaramaiah, when the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission came out, he pointed out that for every 1 rupee of tax contributed by Uttar Pradesh, the state receives 179 back, whereas Karnataka, rather like Telangana today, received 0.47. And he says, how long can you keep incentivizing population growth? Now, this ties into the question of central assistance because it's again striking, and this is not from him, I was doing my own research. Karnataka meets 72% of its expenses from its own state taxes, whereas Bihar meets just 23%. The remaining 77% comes from central allocations. So, unlike most other federal systems, India's revenues go disproportionately to our worst performing states. And those are usually states with poor levels of education, high rates of fertility and population growth. And the South, where these things are done better and there are high-performance states by any yardstick, thereby get short shrift, which is actually going to the heart of the issues of federalism. Because if indeed, as a result of the federal system, you're subsidizing the poorer performing states, in principle, no argument. But if the way in which it's done seems to reward lack of performance, population growth resulting from that particular misgovernance in some of these states, and those who are performing well get penalized. In other words, if Kerala runs much better health outcomes and much better educational outcomes, its reward should not be to get less money from the center for health and for education. But that's de facto what's happening. And this remains a serious problem, it seems to me, and goes to the heart of the whole question as to why many of the southern states are talking to you. I do want to join the others in congratulating the organizers for getting these fine minds from the south together. I think I'm the only one from a non-regional party on this panel, but the idea is precisely that it's high time we woke up to the fact that the south has real concerns.
I just have one provocative thought for the finance ministers, and I think for all of us. You know, when we say federal, are we fully federal? Are we truly federal? You know, if you look at the United States, they're also a federal republic. In the United States, you know, this whole question about devolution, you know, collecting taxes and then devolving, as opposed to that, why can't we think and why can't we propose a system where even the income tax, even the corporate tax is actually collected and, you know, deducted at the source? Why should we pay to the center and then go to Delhi and line up each of our finance ministers and, you know, I wouldn't call it a bowl of sorts, but, you know, kind of make a request, plead with them, and then eventually get our money back a few months later? Why can't we actually be a truly, fully federal republic and actually start collecting taxes at the source, including income tax and corporate tax?
To add to that, from a northern perspective, how do you then deal with the fact that growth paths have taken our country?
When I said that, I mean our share of the income tax and corporate tax. I don't mean the whole thing.
So, but I'm just going to throw out one element to this, which is the challenge of inequality. You have such huge convergence, such huge divergence, which all economic theory would have argued over time would have led closer towards convergence. But there's no sign of that convergence, and we still sit within the union. So there has to be equitable sharing. It is a very integrated economy, as we discovered in the times of COVID. The fact that labor and capital moves, it moves from the north to the south, so there is an interdependency. In some senses, it sharpens the federal, it's a sign of a sharpened federal tension, but also a sign of deepened federalism. So how do we balance these two tensions as we go forward in a fairly fraught environment?
Let me take the simple question first. Right? I mean, I think certainly we have many examples of societies where income taxes or direct taxes happen at multiple levels. So, you know, both KTR and I lived in the US for many years. The federal government takes some tax, the state government takes some tax, the city of New York takes some tax, the city of Los Angeles takes some tax, right? These are all independent of each other. So certainly at some point we have to say that the power of direct taxation has to be given to the states, whatever the constitutional need for that is. But there's a broader problem here. I think in no federal society are all people the same, right? Like economically, you'll always find better offs and less well-offs. The unique problem of India, and why I said to the 15th Finance Commission in my submission, written submission, I said, if equality and efficiency were the targets of finance commissions, then you all have been miserable failures for 25 years. Because every other society in the world, every other country in the world, the US, China, European Union, wherever, you take funds from the better off, you give it to the less well off, and whatever the measure is, it converges. You know, longevity, health measures, per capita income, education access. It converges. That's what the transfers are supposed to do. In our case, not only it doesn't converge, not only it doesn't stay the same, not only it's diverging, it's accelerating in its divergence. So the ratio keeps changing again and again, and still the outcome gets worse and worse. Let's just take Tamil Nadu's case. At one point, we were roughly 7.5% of the population, 7.5% of the GDP, got about 7% of the tax devolution, of that 32% that they devolved. Now we are less than 6%, I think, of the population, about 10.5% of the GDP, and we get about 4% of the taxes. That means for 25 years, these things have been going the wrong way. And we are not getting convergence. So there's something structurally wrong. And what's structurally wrong is not with us. What's structurally wrong is in those northern states where despite getting massive devolution, despite getting massive transfers, they are not able to improve the quality of people's lives, the average education access, or the social development indicators or human development indicators. So if your measures on which you allocate, you know the formula for the Finance Commission, some population, some gap to actual, all these forest cover, land and all that. Clearly they're allocating the money on the wrong dimensions because they keep on allocating more money and things keep getting worse. So there's something profoundly wrong in the developmental model of the northern states, particularly the Hindi belt, that unless that is fixed, no matter how much money you transfer, you're not going to be able to fix the problem. You can do politics with it, but you can't improve people's lives unless you find out what that is. And I have written in my submission, one main thing they can fix is empower women, ensure girls stay in school, delay marriages, get them, better health outcomes, and they haven't done that. That's really, even a state like Gujarat that has slightly higher per capita income than Tamil Nadu, 50% or so of the girls around 18 are not in school. That's not true in any southern state, right? So there's something structurally wrong that money can't fix that needs to be fixed some other way. Otherwise, we are just keeping on going the wrong way. No other country, no other union in the world has this bad an outcome.
I completely agree with him on how miserably they have failed in the north. But they come here and lecture us, by the way. You have to admire their temerity. You have to really admire their guts and temerity to come to the south, lecture all of us on how to run our states and how to actually administer, and how miserably we have done vis-a-vis them. When the fact is, all the indicators, no matter what you take, all the human development indices, all the social indicators will show you otherwise.
There is, I think what both of you are saying gets to the heart of the governance issue. And there is a lot to be learned. That's why federalism matters so much from what different states are doing. So the country learned from the midday meals. The country also learned from Bihar's attempt at giving bicycles to girls to try and bring them, get them to secondary schools. And in all of this, I think one aspect that we haven't talked about much is, and you brought it up in your initial remarks, the question of deliberation, that at the heart of federalism is the idea of coming together to dialogue, to deliberate, to share, to learn, and evolve solutions to these very wicked, hard problems. There has been, Ms. Reddy, if you can reflect a little bit on this, constant attempts in our history of trying to create these so-called sites of deliberation. The Interstate Council, which is now a punishment posting for the bureaucrat. The Planning Commission, everybody said, was filled with all kinds of problems. The National Development Council did not work, so we created the Niti Aayog. But then we left it to the finance departments, or the Ministry of Finance rather, to do deliberation with states. The GST Council, which was meant to be a site of deliberation, it works sometimes, it doesn't on other occasions. How do we think about this institutional question? Are we missing something? And what kind of space do we need for states to come together? The regional coming together, of course, is full of learning. The southern states coming together, the northeastern states coming together. But there's a lot needed for this deliberative environment to come together. Is it an institutional problem as well as much as it is a political problem?
I think it is both, Yamini. Of late, I think last year and this year, together we had two South Zonal Council meetings. I think they were quite well held, and we could see sizable outcome. Of course, I believe for a very long time, zonal council meetings were not held. But again, coming to the fundamental question is, are we a union or a federation? Now, I know it's very difficult not to be speaking for autonomy, not to be speaking in favor of regionalism or sub-regionalism. Because once you speak about unitary, then it becomes dry. But at the same time, India, is it a federation or is it a union? Even though we have certain elements or quite important, quite a lot